I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Kyiv denies they'll make any territorial compromises in the search for peace, we hear the story from Georgia, where upcoming elections could well point the country in an orbit away from Russia.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 2nd of October, 2 years and 226 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley, freelance journalist and former Moscow Times reporter Kateryna Shenheliia-Hanapolska, and former tank commander and chemical weapons expert Hamish de Bretton. I started with the latest battlefield updates from Ukraine and Russia. Let's start inside Ukraine in the Donbass. Russian forces have likely seized Vuhledar, the town of Vuhledar, yesterday. So this is just right down in the sort of southeast corner of the Donbass, just southwest of Donetsk city itself. This follows a reported Ukrainian withdrawal. There are a number of images you'll find on social media of Russian troops in the centre of the town. Reports suggest Ukrainian forces started to withdraw a couple of days ago when the risk of encirclement became too high. Russia had been pushing in from the west and the southwest and also from the east. It looks as if the Ukrainians got out in reasonably good order. A number of Russian mill bloggers said there had been some drone and artillery harassing fire as Ukraine made its withdrawal, but no reports of a rout. Certainly no images of that, which there would have been if it had been in bad order. This is not good news. Obviously, I'm not going to dress it up any other way. It does not, however, automatically mean that Russia will be able to push on from there. Vuhledar is a fairly isolated town surrounded by a rural countryside. Not easy at all to move from there undetected. It would need a huge amount of force protection to try to continue any kind of advance. But even if they're able to, they would need a lot of force protection, particularly air defence, to try to continue the advance to the northwest or to try to link up with that other Russian push in the Donbass in the vicinity of Pokrovsk. That's about 30 k's-ish northeast. So they're not going to close that gap very quickly. It'll be interesting to see what happens now if they do continue to try and push on from there, or if they try to rest and reset before trying again. Now, elsewhere in Ukraine, last night, 11 out of 32 Shahed-type drones launched by Russia overnight were brought down. Ukraine's Air Force said this morning 10 more drones were lost due to electronic warfare, and 4 others exited Ukraine's airspace back towards Russia. Fair enough. Now, some of the drones that did get through attacked port and border infrastructure near the town of Izmail in the southern Odessa Oblast region. That's right down in the south. It's south of Moldova. It's on the Danube River that forms the border with Romania in that area. A Turkish citizen, a truck driver, was said to have been injured in that attack. I've said before, I don't know why Romania/NATO aren't able to provide some form of air defence umbrella that would necessarily extend into Ukraine. But there we go. Ukrainian authorities say Russia targeted the international ferry crossing point across the border, so into Romania. That work at the Olivka crossing point, that's about 15 k's-ish further upstream from the actual port infrastructure. That was temporarily suspended, or work there was temporarily suspended. That comes from Regional Governor Ole Kiper. Elsewhere in the country, Zaporizhia was hit by 6 glide bombs, deaths and injuries there. Casualties also from a number of Russian attacks ranging across the whole country, Kharkiv down to Kherson and pretty much everywhere in between. Now, just a note on the availability of ammunition. There's an interesting point here from Ukraine's first Deputy Defence Minister, Lieutenant General Ivan Vuhledar, who said yesterday the ratio of Russian to Ukrainian artillery ammunition usage has gone down from 8-1 in Russia's favour around last winter and the early months of this year to 3-1 now. Now, General Vuhledar didn't say, or he gave no reason for that. This is me speculating. I think, and there's other comment out there that suggests this, possibly due to recent Ukrainian strikes on Russian ammunition depots, including, you'll remember, those very big and visually soothing strikes a couple of weeks ago that put up a lot of stuff. So there are anecdotal reports from Russian telegram channels of Russian soldiers complaining about a shell shortage at the front. It may be the very clunky and largely unmechanized Russian logistic chains, but it could also be a direct result and an immediate impact of these arms depots going up in smoke. Now, elsewhere, the Warsaw Security Forum, big think tank conference, it started yesterday, concludes today. There's a couple of interesting things I saw from there, interesting and disappointing. Vernon Coker, who's the British Defence Minister in the House of Lords. We have loads of Defence Ministers, okay? We've got the Defence Minister, John Healey, at the moment. Then you've got the Minister for the Armed Forces, then a Minister for Procurement, Minister for Veterans, and there's also a Defence Minister in the House of Lords, and that's who this chap is, Vernon Coker. So, he is a bona fide Defence Minister, but not the Defence Minister. All clear at the back? Well done. Right now, he was speaking of the war in Ukraine, and he said a number of things that I immediately said, well, so what? What are you going to do about it? I was very disappointed. It was a lot of kind of diplomatic word salad and nothing of any real substance in there. I'm going to quote him. He said, "It's a common fight. The front line is in Ukraine, and that's why it's so important to all of us. Of course, it's shown capability gaps. We've seen, for example, that some of the issues around the ability to provide munitions and equipment as quickly as we would want to Ukraine has not been at the level we would want. And the response from Europe has been, what more do we do to work together to ensure that we can get equipment there more quickly? What does it mean for our own stockpiles? So we're looking very carefully now about how we increase, extend and develop those to actually provide more. It's also caused all of us to reflect on how much we're spending on defence." So that's what he said. And I was kind of nodding along to it going, yeah. So yeah, what's your answer to that? When you say it's a common fight, yeah, that's good. The front line's in Ukraine, and that's why it's so important to all of us. Okay, good, yeah, all very important. We've shown capability gaps. What are they? The provision of support and munitions to Ukraine is not at the level we would want, right? Well, you're the minister. What are you going to do about it? You know, what does it mean for our own stockpiles? Good question, Minister. What does it mean for your own stockpiles? How can we get equipment there more quickly? Don't ask me, mate. You're paid the big bucks. So I was very disappointed by that. It was a masterclass in political whataboutism. Just you can identify the problem and throw up all these issues into the air for us to go, my God, what a strategic brain. You can see everything. But he hasn't got any answers. Well, that's no good. Contrast that with the president of Poland, Andrzej Duda, who then popped up and said Poland will allocate 4.7% of GDP to defence next year from Poland. And he said, we do not make this decision with a light heart, but we know the price of defeat. And that in a line, that's it. I mean, that's what I would hope, that followed on by 4.7%. Contrast that with the fairly mealy-mouthed and utterly unsatisfying talk from the British Defence Minister. But maybe I've got it completely wrong and all these things are sorted out behind closed doors. Let me know what you think. Now, a little bit more from the Warsaw Security Forum later with Kat. Just finally for me, an interesting update yesterday from British Defence Intelligence here in London. They put out a daily tweet, UKDI, Defence Intelligence, part of the MOD. They were talking about Ukraine's recent success in pushing back Russian forces in the vicinity of Vovchansk, the area you'll remember Russia pushed into in May this year, kind of just northeast of Kyiv, right up in the northeast of the country. Now, it was thought that Russia was trying to create a buffer zone to prevent Ukrainian attacks across the border into Belgorod Oblast, or possibly they were seeking to establish a launch point for any future attempts to get Russian troops into Kharkiv. It was probably a bit of all of that, a bit of column A, a bit of column B. Now, yesterday's Defence Intelligence tweet said Russia has drawn forces away from the Vovchansk area to support operations in Kursk Oblast. This has almost certainly reduced the Russian ground forces' capabilities in the Vovchansk area. So whilst it may have been perhaps a touch idealistic to expect Ukraine's Kursk incursion to draw Russian forces away from the Donbass, and yes, the grind does continue there, and yes, Vuhledar was taken yesterday, but I think it is not correct to say that the Kursk incursion wasn't worth the effort. And that's not taking into account any of the other potential reasons for attempting it. There's demonstrable, defence intelligence, I don't make me get the capability yardstick out again, but if they're using words like almost certainly, phrases like almost certainly, that's about as close as you're going to get to, yeah, this has happened. And they say that the Russian Vovchansk holding has been negatively impacted from Moscow's point of view because they've had to take forces out of there and push them into Kursk. Anyway, talking of territory, there's been a lot of back and forth in recent days, if not on the actual ground, but certainly in the diplomatic conversational circles. Francis, what is the latest on any supposed quote-unquote territorial compromises?
Well, thanks, Dom. So, yes, one of the topics I talked about yesterday was the backroom conversations that reportedly took place between Ukrainian officials and Western diplomats at the UN General Assembly last week, with the Financial Times writing that Kyiv's new foreign minister, Shenheliia, privately discussed potential compromises with Western counterparts as the price for peace. But, and it's a big one, his office has now publicly refuted that report. Quite an unusual step, with a spokesperson for Ukraine's Foreign Office saying that they unequivocally did not discuss territorial compromises with Russia in recent meetings with its Western counterparts. So, to quote the spokesman, "I attended every single meeting of Foreign Minister Shenheliia's in New York, and no territorial compromises were suggested, discussed, or even hinted at during any of the meetings. To the contrary, the minister's position is rock solid, and he emphasised it behind closed doors. There can be no compromise on Ukraine's sovereignty or territorial integrity." Now, they would say that, of course, so the Financial Times reporting may indeed be what actually took place, leaked by officials who were present. It bears repeating that while there is more talk of negotiations now from Kyiv and wider support among the public for there to be some form of conversation, the public mood, though, is still a far cry from supporting territorial concessions of any sort, which might explain this slapdown, if that's the right phrase. That nuance is really important to emphasise, as I think it's quite misunderstood, frankly. Just because people answer a poll saying they want peace does not mean peace at any price, nor peace that does not mean them achieving their fundamental aims in the war. But Zelensky's government may be calculating those objectives are not going to be possible unless things sharply change. Hence why, privately, they might well be talking about all sorts of things behind closed doors. It would be reckless not to, perhaps. So that's where we are on that. We'll continue to monitor it, and it'll be interesting to see whether the Financial Times pushes back at all to those remarks by the Ukrainians. Now, speaking of reckless attacks militarily, the visually striking but ultimately ineffective strikes on Israel by Iran last night, no one was killed at the time of our recording this, will only distract Western governments further from the European theatre. Interestingly, the Russian Prime Minister arrived in Tehran yesterday before the strikes, which speaks again of the strong relationship between the two countries and may also be suggestive of their deliberately providing some political cover for the Iranians. Now, I'm not suggesting they necessarily knew in advance, but it wouldn't exactly be hard to guess that Iran was going to do something given that they said that they would. And yet Russia went anyway. We should remember, with that in mind, that the destabilisation of the Middle East broadly favours Moscow geopolitically, although not a total implosion, for Russia is still trying to arrange a significant gas deal with Iran, where it purchases some of the energy Europe no longer wants to buy from the Kremlin. So while some assume that the impact of a Middle Eastern war would be positive for Russia, almost entirely so, not least because they argue it would oblige more countries to purchase Russian energy despite sanctions, it would not be an entirely rosy picture for Moscow, given the importance of Iran for economics and also for missiles. Now, it's a briefer section from me today so that we can get to our guests, but there's just one other story I wanted to cover very briefly, Dom. As listeners will know, my nom de plume, or Francophile Francis, has been formally retired, my beret wilting on the rack, as it were, but like it says at the end of every James Bond movie, Francophile Francis will return, or may do. The dust has settled now in Old Paris after the political chaos sown by President Macron's snap election before the Olympics, with the appointment of a new right-wing Prime Minister, Michel Barnier, which we talked about a few weeks ago. He's just given a speech to the French Parliament where Ukraine was mentioned quite extensively, with him pledging that France would remain on the side of the Ukrainian people, something that was greeted with applause in the Parliament. And then he went on, and to quote him in full, "The Ukrainians are people who, for 2.5 years since the beginning of the war of aggression, have been fighting and dying to defend their freedom, sovereignty and territorial integrity. We must understand that they are fighting to defend the values that we also share with them." Barnier then went on to say that France would continue its efforts to establish peace in every part of the world where conflicts are ongoing. And as Ukrainian Pravda writes, key positions in Barnier's government, which began its work last week, are also held by very strong pro-Ukrainian politicians, including the defence minister and foreign minister. But, and it's a big one, is it likely that France will fulfill that leadership role Macron seemed to suggest might be the case a few months back? It feels, frankly, unlikely, as the political temperature in the country has changed. But nonetheless, I don't think we can chalk France up as another of those countries that's going a little bit more the way of being pro-Putin, if we can articulate it in that way. Despite numerous elections recently, I still think that we can say that Macron's government is very much in favour of the Ukrainians winning this war. But, crucially, that does not necessarily equate to them taking a much stronger stance than previously on supporting Kyiv, quite possibly the reverse. But nonetheless, I think some people saying that the election would mean a profound change on France's stance on the conflict was over-egging it somewhat. But we're not done with the political stories, and I'm very happy, Dom, to hand over to our first guest to cover some more stories.
Thanks, Francis. Let's turn to Kat. I hesitate to ask, Francis, what you were doing in 2008, probably back at uni, burning your flag, bad-mouthing your country, all that kind of stuff. Kat's country, Georgia, was being invaded by Russia. Now, Katya, you've just finished interning with Moscow Times. Thank you for coming on the other day and helping us out with a few bits and pieces. Fascinating to look at Georgia, the recent history, and the history you're living through at the moment. I noticed you got Georgian elections in a couple of weeks' time on the 26th of October. It's a critical moment for your country, setting the future direction. Now, I talked earlier on about the Warsaw Security Forum. I saw that the president of Georgia, Salome Zurabishvili, she's pro-EU. The government is not at the moment. She was there at the conference. I'm interested in what she had to say, what your thoughts were. But first, can you give us a sort of ready reckoner, please? How much power does the president of Georgia actually have? Welcome, Kat.
Hi, thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. Hi, Francis, Dom. Before 2018, which was the last presidential elections Georgia had, Georgia was a mix. Think of it like France. We had a pretty powerful president and we had a parliament. However, after 2018, this was basically the last elections when Georgians could directly elect their president. Now Georgia is a parliamentary republic. So, of course, the president still has the power to veto certain laws, and she remains at least a symbolic figure that can speak on behalf of the people in international forums. But unfortunately, or fortunately, the parliament itself can override a veto or force the president to sign bills, even if he or she doesn't want to. So it was originally established as sort of a pro-democratic measure after a pretty bad way in which Saakashvili's presidency ended, but now it's coming back to bite the public because the parliamentary elections, and I'm slightly jumping the gun here, the parliamentary elections is the one most important way in which Georgians will be able to elect the president, because it is the parliament who decides who the next president will be.
Now, can you just give us a sort of wave top for now? We'll do a deeper dive closer to the elections itself, but obviously it's been a very troubled time in Georgia. I mean, certainly before the 2008 invasion by Russia, you've still got, 20% of your country taken, with Russian troops there. They're building a port on the Black Sea. I mean, can you give us a quick update on where Georgia is at the moment in its relationship with Russia, and in particular the ruling party Georgian Dream and how they view the war in Ukraine?
Well, it's as with a lot of things about Georgia, this is very, very complicated. Yes, 20% of Georgian territory does remain occupied. It's not frequent that Georgians and foreigners are kidnapped by Russian occupational forces if they are located near these occupied territories. Russian occupational forces also frequently literally move the border and continue to expand their occupation territory kilometer by kilometer. As for Georgian dream, there's an interesting kind of dichotomy. You get sort of a Schrodinger's Georgian dream where on one side, they continuously talk about how, our futures, because they know that the public wants to go toward the West. So they will say, look, yeah, we're going toward Europe. We're signing this law. Check out, like here, we're hanging out with this European leader or that European leader. And then shortly after, you find out that Russian propagandists who talk about how Georgia needs to be wiped out managed to fly into Georgia and hang out there. We had Russian politicians who sat on the chair of the Speaker of the Parliament a couple years back. You have rhetoric that is extremely anti-Western, although, as later we'll talk about it, we'll be able to dive a bit more into the rhetoric of the Global War Party. And you have, Russian businesses that can pop up in Georgia and turn Georgia into a virtual cooperator of Russia by using Georgia as a place to bring in goods into Russia that are otherwise sanctioned. So there's this attempt to play both sides. The only difference is, and maybe sometimes people forget, is that maybe Serbia can do that. But Serbia is not bordering Russia, and 20% of its territory is not occupied. And Serbia did not have a war with Russia a little more than a decade ago. So it remains to be seen just how hardcore Georgian Dream will choose to spread the fires of its rhetoric. But it is starting to have consequences because whereas before, Georgian Dream would say something, but it didn't matter much, we're now 2.5 years into the war with Ukraine, a war that the public, majority of the public, views as their own war. As Zurabishvili herself, remarked, she connected Moldovan elections during the summit, Moldovan elections, the war in Ukraine and Georgian elections with prosperity of the Black Sea region and European prosperity at large. And to Georgians, it is unacceptable for us to pick any other path and to collaborate with the Russians or go soft on them in any means.
Thank you. I mean, we saw a lot of pictures recently in the last month or so of great protests in Georgia against the so-called Russian bill. It really seemed as if there was some violence, but it looked as if the country was going to be, or could very easily tip into the abyss. It's something Francis covered at the time in terms of the news and background as much as we're able to. But lift the bonnet, explain the Russian bill, explain why it was so provocative and quite where it sits right now.
Well, bills like the Foreign Agent Law, which in Georgia is called the Russian Foreign Agent Law, the Russian bill, they exist in different countries. If you have an organization that operates, for example, here in the United Kingdom, and it receives funding from another government, it obviously has to declare that. But the difference, it's not about just what the bill's purposes, it's about its implementation. And that was really the catalyst of why so many people were outraged about the Foreign Agent Law. Unfortunately, it went through, it got accepted, and the Georgian Dream is, trying its best right now to put pressure on as many organizations as possible. I think Transparency International, which is quite a big player in monitoring fairness of Georgian elections. They basically threw their hands up and said, look, like with the amount of pressure we're facing, and because the Georgian Anti-Corruption Bureau classified them as an entity, quote, with a declared electoral goal, they're not going to be there to monitor the fairness of elections. Of course, Zurabishvili, when she was supposed to sign the bill, she vetoed it, basically saying that in its nature, the bill is a Russian law. It's not one of your American foreign agent laws. But unfortunately, the parliament said, whatever, we don't care, and passed it anyway with a clear majority because they have a parliamentary majority. And we are seeing Georgian civil society, majority of which is funded by international organizations with good goals in mind, with nothing suspicious, with, encouraging education, with helping people, get surgeries that they need to obtain because the government is not there for the public. They're facing pressure, and many of them are saying, look, if this continues, if we're going to be harassed by the police, by security authorities, we will have to cease operations. And that will be absolutely tragic because the civil society that Georgian Dream is trying to target fills in gaps that the government itself is meant to fulfill. But it's failing to because its priority is not being concerned with, the future of young Georgians who want to be closer to Europe, who want to receive the same education as, for example, you or Francis received. They're concerned with immediate economic benefit for themselves in a very much oligarchic fashion.
Thank you. I'm not sure anyone's quite received the same education as Francis, but there we go. Now, before we go, Kat, would love to hear from you again closer to the election, but you have a family connection, I understand. I'm going to get this totally wrong. Am I right in thinking that it was your uncle was previously in the position of PM? And if so, how has it changed since his time in power?
It's funny you ask because I actually can see that my mom's listening. Hi, Mom and Dad. So you could say, distant relative, my uncle, Zurab Zhvania, was the Prime Minister of Georgia shortly after Rose Revolution. Unfortunately, he left us too early, but along with many, many other fantastic figures in modern post-Rose Revolution Georgian history, he was an advocate of Euro integration, really the brains behind moving closer to Europe, not just in order to have higher pensions, but through establishing critical political reform. You can actually find a lot of his transcribed lectures as well. And he was one of the people who coined a very famous phrase, I am Georgian, therefore I'm European, a phrase that you may have seen or heard quite a lot in the recent protests. And so, his spirit lives on among those Georgians who protested and who likely will protest if we see that these elections are going to be unfair and undemocratic. So there's that.
Lovely. Thanks, Kat. Well, we will speak again closer to and through the elections on the 26th of October. It's fascinating to see how broad all the issues that we're dealing with here. Obviously, we focus on the war in Ukraine, but of course, all the issues with what it's doing to 21st century security architecture, the rule of law, future of the UN, all that kind of stuff is absolutely fascinating. And you can draw them all down into Russia's malign influence in Georgia's desire from the younger populations to turn west, etc., etc. So we will speak again, but thank you so much today, Kat. Thanks for coming on. Now, talking about the wider context and where there may or may not be opportunity, Hamish DBG, lovely to have you back on. You have seen opportunity for both Ukraine and Russia in the ongoing situation in the Middle East, I believe. How so?
Hi, chaps. Hi, Kat. Very nice to meet you. Talk about 2008. I think I was in Afghanistan at the time, but that is another story. But looking at the current situation and the fact that so much is looking towards the Middle East, but it's all inextricably linked. I wrote a piece in the paper on Friday, I think it was, really about how Starmer and Biden must avoid throwing Zelensky under the proverbial Russian bus by not giving him the capabilities, particularly from a British perspective, Storm Shadow, to be able to attack into Russia or into a couple of hundred miles into Russia, as it were, to prevent a lot of those missiles and other drones, etc., being fired into Ukraine. But when we look at what happens in the Middle East and overnight, very interesting, Dom, your observation about Russians in Tehran at the moment. I think we discussed on the pod a couple of weeks ago that Tehran had given Russia a whole bunch of ballistic missiles, which probably feeling a little bit glum about, not least, of course, that they fired 500 missiles to Israel, including the ones in April, and 95+% of them being knocked down. And that's another issue, which actually I'll come to in final thoughts. But, the quid pro quo, it seems to me, is that it's probably Russian technology and probably Russian nuclear technology what Tehran is all about, because the reason that things aren't balanced between Iran and Israel is probably the nuclear piece. Stand fast that the Israeli military is far superior than the Iranians anyway. So that is a concern. But that gives opportunities. One would think that Putin will try and exploit everything that's happening in the Middle East. And he sees all Western leaders and the US and NATO looking towards the Middle East. And I hazard to say, good commander. Anybody will try and seize an advantage where they can. But I think it's very important that we just don't look down the sort of Russian barrel, because there are also advantages, I think, for Ukraine here, not least allowing them to attack into Russia, as we've discussed. And in my piece on Friday, I also talk about the dreadful morale in the Russian army. I did discuss it when I was in Telegraph Towers on Tuesday last week, so I won't repeat that. But one of my concerns is that as our leaders, Western leaders, look at what's happening, and after the Iranian assault last night, the concern that the US and the UK might get more heavily involved in Ukraine, they're suddenly looking at their stocks of critical military capability and hardware, and no doubt thinking, well, we actually might be needing them against Iran rather than giving them to Ukraine. And I'm thinking exactly things like, Storm Shadow and other bits of kit. And I hope that is not going to be the case, because I personally believe, and I have written a piece on this about the sort of humiliation of Iran, which I think is going to be up online later in the paper, that Iran humiliated with the attack on Hezbollah, its sort of forward proxy, humiliated with its failure to land any punches on Israel with its missile attack overnight. Actually, it sort of fought itself not to a stalemate, but a position it can't do much more, mainly because, it doesn't have those nuclear weapons that we've talked about. So my key thing when we look at it strategically is that Western leaders don't become too unbalanced and look down, a very narrow periscope towards the Middle East. My personal view is still what happens in Ukraine has more direct effect on UK, British security and defence than what is happening in the Middle East. And actually, it might be an opportunity if we give Ukraine the go-ahead for them to make some pretty significant moves before the winter sets in, before whatever happens in the US election. And let's hope they take advantage of it. Over.
Thanks, Hamish. I've got a question, but I need to keep it short because otherwise I'll be in trouble with the Battle Lines teams and I'll have to present myself to Venetia Yellow Pages down the back of the trousers again. But on the issue here, you may have seen Nicholas Drummond's comments, defence analyst's comments, saying that he was opining that Russia may have given Tehran a couple of nuclear weapons in return for all the ballistic missiles and Shaheeds and all the rest of it that Iran has supplied. Others were of the opinion, no, if there was the faintest whiff that Tehran had got hold of nuclear weapons, they would be gone by now. The Israelis would not allow that to happen. Where do you stand on that debate? And separately, what do you think this says about deterrence now? Obviously, Iran's ability to deter Israel has failed. Hezbollah has been very seriously eroded. Iran has just shown that its military capability, direct military capability, is not the sucker punch that they may have hoped it was. So what does that say of deterrence? But those two things, just very briefly, before I get in trouble with Battle Lines.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I don't think there's a snowball's chance in hell that Russia has passed any nuclear weapons to Tehran directly. I think there is too much intelligence around the place for that to happen. And the scrutiny that no doubt, the major Western intelligence services have, particularly around Russian military capability, if there was any hint that these things were being moved from somewhere in Russia to somewhere in Iran, I'm pretty sure it would be picked up. I've said before that I think Putin's bluff and bluster over his tactical nuclear weapons is exactly that, because we sort of know where they are, and to move them is really identifying. And that's what the nuclear deterrence is all about, really, that one has that balance. So, no, I don't think that the technology thing is the concern. And when people say, what are the Israelis going to do next? The Iranians have got their nuclear labs around Isfahan and everywhere else. But if I was a nuclear scientist in Iran, I would want eyes in the back of my head at the moment, because they are the sort of knowledge banks that are so key. When we come on to deterrence, I think the ultimate deterrence is the nuclear deterrence, which is what our defence is based on. And when I occasionally have the distinct displeasure of speaking to Stop the War people and others, I sort of underwrite that. It is absolutely kept the peace. And with Iran, if Iran had nuclear weapons, we would be in a completely different position now in the Middle East. We might well be escalating to some sort of nuclear confrontation. So when it comes to deterrence, nuclear is absolutely top of the pile. And that is, I think, where Iran has failed. Even conventionally, Israel vastly overmatches it. So deterrence is key. And I get frustrated, I'm sure a lot of people do, when some of our Western leaders, particularly some of the more timid ones, appease people like Putin and the Ayatollahs in Tehran because they don't understand the deterrence piece. So the ultimate deterrence, nuclear, I think, is fundamental to keeping global peace. And the people who talk about Armageddon and all the rest of it, it would have happened in the last 75, 80 years if it was a likelihood. The fact it hasn't is the fact that nuclear deterrence is fantastically effective. And that, I think, is why Iran has failed. And let's hope forever that they never get the ability to have nuclear weapons. Because just the final bit on this, Dom, because when you have people like the Ayatollahs, you have people like Kim Jong-un, who do not, I'm not saying they're crazy, but they don't have a global understanding and view on things. That's when it gets really dangerous. So at the moment, I think we're in a much better position than we would have been if Tehran had nuclear capability.
Sure thing. At escalation below the nuclear threshold, there are other ways of doing it. And in particular, your speciality of chemical, biological warfare. What have you seen? Has there been any move? We spoke to you a few weeks ago about the gas attacks, the kind of riot control agents, which can be lethal in the doses that they might accumulate in the bottom of a trench or a bunker. But have you seen any more movement there in terms of any kind of chemical or chemical precursor use in Ukraine?
Well, yeah, Don, I have actually, and I'm in pretty close contact with a lot of the sort of units there, trying to give them advice. And I was speaking, I won't mention what these units are, their designation, because that would give their positions away. But I was speaking to a brigade yesterday who had been attacked 5 times that day, again, with riot control agents. Now, unfortunately, they didn't have any respirators or gas masks. But I was also talking to another organisation, and there was a suggestion that nerve agents have been used. Now, I don't want to set any horses running here, but although riot control agents and chloropicrin are chemical warfare agents, you and I have had a sniff of them in the gas chamber getting our respirators fitted. Pretty unpleasant and being very effective on the front lines that the Russians are using on an industrial scale. But nerve agent is completely off the scale. If chloropicrin is toxicity 1 sort of thing, a nerve agent like sarin would be about 5 or 10,000. And the other thing about nerve agents, they're persistent. Riot control agents disperse in 5 to 10 minutes. A nerve agent could be around for weeks or months or even longer, so a real long-term hazard. I would say if you are going to suggest this, we really need some pretty strong intelligence to back that up. But I'm talking to you from Salisbury today, site of the Russian nerve agent attack in March 2018, and the Board of Inquiry into that attack starts next week. So it's very fresh in people's minds here. I absolutely don't think the Russians can go nuclear in Ukraine, but there is a possibility they might up their chemical weapon usage. And Starmer, Biden, the West, NATO must treat any WMD like that exactly the same. Although it might be not as horrific, it is again still illegal under every single convention in the world. And if there is a whiff of nerve agents, then we need to shout about it as loudly as we can. But I say at the moment, I haven't seen any hard evidence, just hearsay. Over.
Let's start drawing to a close then, round the bazaars for final thoughts. Kat, can I come to you first, please? What would you like to leave us with?
I think it's important for those who are interested in Ukraine, in East Europe, to just keep an eye out for the next couple of days and see what happens regarding the elections. In Georgia, we'll be trying to provide updates here. I trust that Dom and Francis can do that if I'm not here. There are many, many wonderful observers and newspapers and YouTubers who are ready to pick up the job if needed. I really do think that what will happen in Moldova and in Georgia this year will be pivotal for what direction the region chooses to go in. And just because Georgia and Moldova are small countries definitely doesn't mean that they don't have an impact. And I hope for the best.
Thanks, Kat. We will hear from you again soon. Hamish, can I ask you for your final thoughts, please?
Thanks, Dom. My question is why doesn't Ukraine have the Iron Dome that Israel has? Israel's Iron Dome, layered air defense from 2,500 kilometers out back to very local, and it's knocking down 95% plus of missiles, drones fired at it. If Ukraine had that capability, again, they would be in a different position. And I know it's taken the Israelis years to build it up. Synchronization, the automation, the use of AI and everything else is phenomenal. But that is the sort of thing that I hope is being discussed in the 4th and 5th floor in Whitehall and its equivalent in Washington, D.C. But we shall see. And like everybody else, I'm thinking deeply about the great man that we're going to say goodbye to tomorrow. And see you there. Over.
Thanks, Hamish. Francis, please. Final thoughts for today.
Well, thanks, Dom. Firstly, thank you to everyone who's written in following our discussion yesterday about national cemeteries. John, Peter, Annette, Dan, Patrick. I couldn't read all of those names there who've written in, but it was really interesting reading your reflections. I haven't appreciated, actually, that the US has multiple national cemeteries akin to Arlington, over 150 in America. So thanks for teaching us about that. So even if Ukraine does have its own national cemetery, it would not necessarily void the idea of there being multiple such cemeteries across the country. But my main final thought, of course, returns to David. As you say, Dom, tomorrow is the funeral, which will be attended by many hundreds of people, including representatives from the Ukrainian and US embassies. The link is in the show notes for those who wish to join us at 11:15 London time digitally to watch the service from afar. An aspect of his life, which I wanted to draw attention to again, which we only were able to fleetingly reference before now, is how many lives his work has saved in Ukraine itself. As Ada Wordsworth of the charity KHARRP, who listeners will know rebuilds homes and communities in the eastern regions of the country, many of them formerly occupied by the Russians, wrote in her newsletter this week. David invited me to speak on the podcast, and the resulting interview led to the largest influx of donations we have ever seen. Still, on a near weekly basis, we receive emails from supporters saying that they found our work via Ukraine the Latest. Following that interview, David stayed in touch. He was always checking in on our team and the communities we support, and KHARRP ended up being featured several more times on the show. He had planned to come to Kharkiv and go around the villages we support, and to follow up on the families who were supported with the initial load of Telegraph-related donations. From those initial donations alone, he repaired over 60 houses. With this being the impact of just one of the hundreds of podcast episodes which David organised and presented, it is impossible to imagine how many lives he must have transformed. We are so grateful to him. That, I know, is true for many charities that David drew attention to, and we firmly intend to do the same, something we'll update you on about and after the funeral. You have been incredibly supportive of us these past few weeks, but I wanted to end by just extending a proper hand of sympathy to you, wherever you're listening around the world. We know how many of you miss David's words and reassuring presence, a beacon in the darkness of these troubling times. Many of you have written to us to express your profound grief, and I don't use that word lightly, for our friend, having shed tears when we announced his passing, and many of you still, even now, trying to process the shock, as we are. So we hope this funeral, by being broadcast, will bring us all together in some way, his family, his friends, his colleagues, and those of you around the world who've listened to his work for the past 2.5 years. And we hope that that will bring you some comfort as well. We'll see you there.
Thanks, Francis. Thank you, everybody, for getting in touch. Thank you for your continued support. We do read every email still. We're working through a huge backlog. Thank you so much for that. We are going to be, Francis and I will be at the funeral tomorrow, but don't worry. You are going to be here in the very capable hands of chap sat to my right. No, I'll leave a little bit of mystery, shall I?
Keep them in suspense.
Keep you in suspense. But we'll be back tomorrow, same time. That's what he would have expected. Same time, same place. From everybody here at the Telegraph Newsroom in London, I wish you all a very good afternoon. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Alexis Adimora. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.